Okay, I think we are good. Everyone is on so far, but I'll keep an eye on the wait room and let folks in that are joining us. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining today's seminar series with the Worcester Regional Chamber of Commerce. I am excited to have our presentation today with the En-ROADS team to talk about a very important subject and matter in our lives and our world. And certainly it will be an interactive and engaging seminar. So I'm really glad you all are able to join us and be a part of it today. Just a few things, we are recording, so we will be able to share this recording after we complete the seminar today. The chat box is open, so please feel free to share your contact information, your name, your business, your email, if you'd like for networking purposes. And of course, any questions we are going to ask to please utilize the chat box for. So our presenters are going to keep an eye on that throughout today. So please, anything that you have throughout the presentation, put in that chat box. Keep yourselves muted. And then of course, if you want to participate, unmute, and we'd love to hear from you. So before we begin, I do just want to thank today's sponsor, TD Bank. I do just have a quick little word from them. They couldn't be on today, but TD Bank is proud of its long-standing partnership with the Worcester Regional Chamber of Commerce in sponsoring relevant educational events that benefit our local business community. We hope that you find today's series topic useful with actionable takeaways. And that is from Anthony Pasquale, Regional Vice President, Central Mass, TD Bank. So thank you, TD Bank, again, for sponsoring our seminar series for this year. And I just wanted to, quick little intro to this team today. Meg Haight Hardwick is going to introduce everyone presenting today. I had the pleasure of going through this a few months back with Tim Murray and Alex Guardiola with Meg personally, so I had a little advantage today. But it was very eye-opening, and it was certainly something that we all got together after and said, this is what we need to offer to our membership and to our community, to let them know really what is available for us and the information and knowledge that's out there, and just to get the conversation going more than it already is and more than it needs to be. So Meg, I thank you so much, and to your team for all your preparation up to today. I know it's a lot of information, it's a lot of research, so thank you so much. And without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you to the Chamber and to TD Bank for enabling this to happen. We're really, really happy to be here to share what is a really helpful tool for understanding climate and climate systems and the impact of what we can do about it. And I would echo Stephanie that we're going to have your assistance in part of this. And so the chat box can be an active part of this afternoon's presentation. I have a team here of people with me. We're all members of Citizens Climate Lobby, and it's a nonprofit volunteer organization. There's well over 100,000 of us citizens, and we are concerned about the climate. Our organization focuses on national policy, but we also do lots of local outreach, education, workshops such as this, and also interface with local and state representatives. And I'd like to introduce the team to you. And we also became aware of the En-ROADS simulator and have been trained as certified facilitators and ambassadors. And this is a program that is being used around the world. So if you'll just raise your hand, team, when I introduce you. Jim Lagomarsino is a former educator and school administrator focused on science, and he has been studying and teaching climate change for well over 25 years. And David Mazumder, graduate student at MIT, he also serves as Citizens Climate Lobby's liaison to Senator Ed Markey. Rob Bonney is here and is the chapter leader for Citizens Climate Lobby on the North Shore. He's a novelist and a budding playwright. We may have Rebecca Keller join us. She is there she is. Hi, Rebecca. She is a chartered financial analyst and is part of the leadership team of Business Climate Leadership. And I'm a retired business executive. I do a lot of these kinds of workshops, and I regularly participate in Citizens Climate Lobby's meetings with Representative Jim McGovern's office. So what we're going to do today is tell you what En-ROADS is, and I'll give you a couple examples of how it works. But what we really need is your help, because we'd like you to create a scenario by which we can avoid going higher than a 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in average global temperatures, which is the target established in the Climate Paris Accords. It's a target that's been identified as important because exceeding it means that the climate consequences of warming become more and more severe. And so you'll help us create a scenario to achieve just that using the simulator. And then we'll certainly leave time for review and questions, insights. And it might be a good idea to start talking about, well, what might this mean for businesses? So the simulator was developed by MIT Sloan and an independent nonprofit think tank called Climate Interactive. And why they created it? Well, the climate system behaves such that it's extremely challenging for us to fully anticipate and understand the long-term consequences of our decisions. And globally, we're grappling with how are we going to preserve a viable future? Businesses are trying to figure out the changing energy landscape. Governments are trying to decarbonize their economies, at the same time improve the quality of life for their citizens. Well, all of this we're trying to do in the context of what is clear are complex dynamic systems, and the behaviors get shaped by how you have the interplay of where we invest, what our policy choices are, technology progress, and the slow turnover of existing infrastructure. And why En-ROADS helps? Well, it's a fast simulation tool. So real time, you can see what happens if you decide to take action on a particular policy or intervention. It's online and free to all. Once you leave here, you will know exactly how to go see it again and use it yourself. It explores the impacts of what happens if we change our energy sources, consumption of energy, and the policies. So it helps us understand in particular the speed and the scale of reductions in emissions that we need to make to reach our climate goals. And hopefully we will be able to make better informed decisions by virtue of that. And so let's go right to the simulator. Some of you may have had a chance to review a little bit of information about it. But what you are going to see right now, this is what we call the dashboard. There's a lot of information, graphs, and so on behind it. And I'm going to give you an overview of what you're looking at. It's kind of busy, but if you look at the upper left quadrant, what we're dealing with here are what are the global sources of primary energy and what the forecast is for how much of it we're going to use this century. So this timeline takes us out to 2100. And this shows what the current projections, if we continue business as usual, what the projections are on total amount of energy that we're going to be using and when, and also where we're going to be getting this energy. And it's color coded for ease. So brown is coal, red, oil, blue is natural gas, green are our renewables, pink bioenergy, blue is nuclear. Over on the right graph, this shows the business as usual projection of what is going to happen with greenhouse gas net emissions going up into the atmosphere. We know that it's the greenhouse gases that trap heat and are causing warming. You can see it's forecasted, even with the good things we've been doing up until now, it's still going up. And because of that, we're projected to reach by 2100 around a 3.6 degree increase, 3.6 degrees centigrade increase in average global temperature. We're more familiar with Fahrenheit, that's 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit. This outcome is, in one word, catastrophic. We need to work towards not exceeding 1.5 degrees centigrade. And how we're going to do that is by utilizing, on the lower half of the screen, the interventions or climate actions. On the left, we have the panoply of what are our energy sources and what will the mix be. So we have all of our fossil fuels, our renewables, nuclear, and so on. What will happen if we encourage or discourage the use of any one or more of these energy sources? In the area of transport, our cars, trucks, rail, what's the impact if we get more efficient? What's the impact if we electrify a lot of our transportation? For buildings and industry, buildings are residential, commercial, industry, how our factories operate. Here again, if we get more efficient in using the energy, we would need a little less. So what happens there? What happens if we electrify more? The model will show what happens if population growth is more or less than is projected to happen. What happens if economic growth is more or less? And then over on the right, some other important interventions. Land, what happens if we stop deforestation? We reduce the amount or rate at which forest deforestation is occurring. What happens if we reduce the amount of methane going up into the atmosphere and other sources of greenhouse gases? And then finally, carbon removal. We know at this point, we need carbon removal as one of the ways to achieve our goals. It can be done via trees, because we know they pull carbon dioxide out of the air. There's also technological ways that can be developed to do that. So what I would like to do is just show you in action the simulator to give you an idea of how it works. And I'd like you to, first we're going to take a look at what happens if we discourage the use of coal. And I'd like you to think about, if we use less coal, what is likely to happen regarding how much energy we'll use, what's likely to happen in terms of emissions and future temperature. So the simulator allows me to actually make a decision to put a tax on coal. And what you can see is that it did have an effect on emissions, but emissions continue to go up, and it helped, but not a lot, in reducing projected future temperature. Now, if I can bring your eye back over, and if you'll particularly watch coal, I can kind of replay on the simulator. This is where we started. That's after we taxed it. The beginning, taxing. So we can see that by virtue of putting a tax on it, we did reduce the amount of coal. Just to give you a teaser into some of the additional things the simulator can help, and don't worry about how I'm getting to certain places, it's more to look at the outcomes. We talk about, should we continue building coal plants? And so the question is, what happens if in the year 2025, we stop building new coal infrastructure? Up in your upper left, watch the coal blue area. So what has happened is, by the end of the century, we basically are stopping using coal because we stopped building plants in this time frame. And so they've gone through their life cycle and been retired. And you can see over here that it helped more with greenhouse gas emissions coming down, and therefore the temperature. So that is one example of an intervention that has an impact. And before we let you start making decisions, I'd like to show you just one more. And a lot of times people say, well, what happens if we plant a lot more trees? So that's afforestation. And I'd like you to think about, well, let's say we plant a lot more forests or restore a lot more of our forests. What will be the impact here? I'll give you a spoiler. It's not going to affect your sources of energy because it doesn't have a correlation to where we're getting our energy. But certainly we know it should pull carbon dioxide out of the air, so our net emissions should go down, and therefore that should help with future temperature growth. So let us plant a lot more trees. So that's high growth in forests, and you might have expected it to do more than you can see here. Well, one thing to recognize is that if you look at where this blue line starts diverging, this is the current scenario with more forests. It's not until farther out in the century that it has an impact, because to do afforestation, you need to get the land, plant the trees, and grow them. And another impact is that, or another factor you need to be aware of in doing that, is how much land will it take? This graph shows you how much additional land would need to be applied to forestry in order to achieve this improvement. And as a reference point, this dotted line represents the area of the country of India. So that gives you an inclination of this is a good thing to do for many reasons, but it is not a high leverage climate reduction policy. So that is just a flavor of how the simulator works. And at this point, what we're next going to do is, with your help, what we would like to do is decide which of these interventions we'll take, and we'll continue accumulating them so that cumulatively what we want to create is a 1.5 degree scenario. So if you will please tell us in the chat, or raise your hand and unmute and tell us which one of those two you might like to look at. Karen.
I'd like to see what happens as far as slowing down deforestation.
Okay, we'll do that. And I'm going to turn it over at this point to Jim and to David to facilitate this part of it. And again, please keep entering in the chat what you would like to do. And I'll just get us started with moving deforestation. Think about how it will help. And Jim and David, if you'll run with it.
So when you thought about deforestation, obviously we know that's happening, particularly with the rainforests and the Amazons and so forth. And you see that if we stop doing that, it does help, just like adding more forests helps, but it's only a very small amount. It only dropped the temperature by the end of the century by 3.2, 3.5 degrees, which is only a 1/10 of a degree drop. And so as important as it is for all the other reasons that cutting down forests is not good for the planet, the animals on the planet and the humans, it doesn't do a great job of reaching the kind of magnitude we need to reduce the global temperature. Okay, does someone else have another one that they'd like to see?
It looks like Stephanie's put in the chat that she's interested to see what can happen if we manipulate natural gas supply, for example. Right now, there's a big push to electrify everything, and from your stove to how you heat your house. So let's see if there's, if we move away from natural gas, what impact will that have?
Okay, so I will do that. And we very highly tax natural gas. I can do even more.
And yeah,
And Meg, would you replay that change there?
I will. This was
And
where
what-
we were with a little bit of help from deforestation. We were at 3.5.
so we
Okay.
dropped another 1/10 of a degree. And that's going in the right direction, but it's a long way from where we need to be. So while they have very positive aspects to them, both deforestation and reducing natural gas, we see that they don't have a great impact by themselves on reducing our global temperature by the end of the century. Now, I see here that someone said that they'd like to see what would happen with an increase in population growth.
So we went back up.
So
More population.
these population
Watch-
estimates
watch
are
the-
sort of estimated by the United Nations, and
Yes.
Meg, if you click on that the little ellipses there under population, then we can actually see how many billions of people are expected to be living on this planet in the year 2100. And at baseline, it's set to be around 10.9 billion souls. But if we see an increase of about 1 billion people, for example, where we just were, then we see that we've actually backtracked here. And the more folks who are living on the planet, the more resources we're consuming and the more energy that we're demanding. And if most of our energy is still coming from fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases, then that's going to contribute to the problem rather than help solve it. But so this is an important point. And thank you, Miranda, for suggesting that, because these are just the best estimates based on what our expert demographers can project, but it may be the case that they're off by some amount. In fact, the bounds of this population lever here that we're looking at are the 95% confidence interval that the demographers of the United Nations have set. So there's a 95% chance that it will fall somewhere within this range, and the most likely number is 10.9 billion, but it could very easily go higher than that.
All right, I see another one here. It says, there's only so much coal, oil, and gas on the planet. What would our world look like if we ran out of these resources? And you said you might not want to wait till the end of you may want to wait till the end to show us this, but what if our only source was being renewables? Well, there was a time where we kept saying that we were looking at the end of oil, but it seems that we have new technologies which are able to find oil reserves in places where we did not know they existed previously. And that technology is likely to increase. As far as running out of coal is enormous reserves all over the planet, not only in the United States and in China, but particularly in Australia. And so there are enormous amounts of coal, and natural gas is one that we're just tapping now. I don't think that the running out of those things is something that is a major concern of most of the industry people. The goal seems to be more for people who are concerned about the climate, that we keep those natural resources in the ground.
Well, perhaps in line with that question, it begs the question of, well, what will happen if we increase or subsidize renewables? So should we look at that?
Yeah, I think that was in the question too, yes.
So we have subsidized renewables, and I'll let you see the replay of where we were just prior to that one additional action. And it helped a bit. But even with that, we can see that the amount of fossil fuels being used is large. The reason subsidizing renewables isn't as powerful as you might think is that the price of them, they're already growing quickly on their own. And so a subsidy really doesn't have that much more power to them. But also, it just takes time to manufacture and install and utilize these sources of renewable energy. So it's growing. You would expect it to continue to grow. But given this action, we're still at this level of future temperature.
I see that Alex has asked, there's been a lot of talk about methane emissions and how it is drastically added to climate change. I would like to see how the reduction would help, but moreover, how do we reduce these emissions, particularly with our farmers and others? Well, you are absolutely correct, Alex. Methane emissions are a particular problem. Methane is about 100 times more heat trapping than even CO2 is. It doesn't last as long in our atmosphere, but is a very, very powerful heat trap. And you can see that when Meg highly reduced the amount of methane, the temperature dropped 0.3 degrees, which is quite significant. We have many sources of methane. When we drill natural gas wells, there's a lot of methane leakage. There is a lot of methane that comes from cattle. And there's a lot of methane that is coming from the melting permafrost. And all of these are of concern. Perhaps the melting permafrost is the most concerning because that's what we call a feedback loop. As temperatures warm, more methane is released. As more methane is released, it traps more heat, causing more warming, melting more permafrost, and that's why it's called a feedback loop. As far as the farmers, one of the things that a lot of people have obviously heard and talked about is reducing the amount of meat consumption, particularly with beef, and all that it takes as far as CO2 and methane production in raising beef.
And just to stay tuned, I know that modeling agriculture has been tricky. And so this one category includes methane and agricultural methane. In quite soon, in several weeks, we expect that they will be enhancing the model to make more discrete differences between the sources. And that will be, again, another step forward in helping with decision making. So that's where we're at now is 3 degrees, and we still have 1.5 to go. It's getting hot. Help.
It looks like we had one suggestion about looking into some of the provisions of the Green New Deal from Miranda. Maybe we could start there with so that's something that a lot of folks talk about in terms of the Green New Deal is looking at better retrofits of our buildings. So maybe we could look into how we could increase the energy efficiency of some of our buildings and our industrial processes there. Oh, okay. So a lot of things happen here. If we look on the right-hand side, we're reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we're producing, and we're getting down another 0.3 of a degree centigrade, which is very exciting. One of the larger effects that we've seen so far. And at the same time, on the left-hand side, we've seen a decrease in the total amount of energy that is being used across the globe. So the stacked all these stacked bars are in total are shrinking down, and we're actually using less of all the resources except for oil. And part of the reason for that is that most oil use is designated for transportation purposes, but we are using fewer renewables. We're using less natural gas, and we're using less coal to generate electricity, partly because of the energy efficiency gains that we get from investing in these building retrofits and making sure that all buildings that are going up in the future are more energy efficient.
Great.
Thanks for the suggestions, Miranda and Karen. Another piece of something that folks talk about in the Green New Deal is about this getting rid of the subsidies for fossil fuels and investing instead in renewable energy. So we're already subsidizing renewables here. We've taxed natural gas. We could also put a tax on coal and oil. But I think there was another idea Karen suggested earlier on about looking at what a carbon price might do. So instead of taxing individual fossil fuels, we could put a fee on the amount of carbon dioxide, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are being produced from a given process. What happens if we apply a carbon price here?
That's a big drop.
And I'll replay. Oops.
And you can even increase it over the length of the century.
Okay, so this is about twice the size of the largest reductions in warming that we've seen so far. We saved 0.6 of a degree Celsius in avoided warming here. And how did we manage that? It looks like by applying a fee on carbon, we've made all of the fossil fuels more expensive. And so that has dramatically reduced the amount of natural gas that people use for electricity, as well as the amount of coal, especially because the carbon content per unit of energy released from coal combustion is about twice the amount from natural gas. So this really hits coal hard, but it also does so for natural gas when you get this carbon price to be a very high one, like we've specified here. And what does that actually mean? That's around $200 per ton of carbon dioxide. In turn, we've seen that there's been a larger increase in the amount of renewables that are fueling our electricity sector because of they have to take up the slack from these more expensive, less desirable fossil fuel sources of electricity.
And most carbon pricing suggestions or models that people have come up with start with a significantly lower price on carbon, but it increases year after year, so that there's a time for adaptation to the increased carbon cost of fuels, but ultimately you'll see that it's going to go quite high sooner than later.
And this chart would reflect, you could modify this such that you would start with a carbon price, but continue it going up more gradually, but higher ultimately, to really get the temperature down.
We're nearly to our goal, just above 2 degrees centigrade there. It looks like Bradford is suggesting what happens when economic growth increases. Let's say we're able to beat the expectations of world economists today, and we're able to grow the world's economy at a faster rate.
So let's replay it.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm replaying the little increment I made. My apology. This is more accurate. Here we go. It's interesting, of course, growth in GDP means more demand on energy. So we certainly saw the amount of energy being going up. The demand for more energy goes up with GDP growth or economic growth. But what we also noticed, because of the carbon price, the demand for energy tended to spur, if you will, growth in the renewable energy area. So that's a very positive outcome in that sense.
And the other thing to remember is that once you have, leveraged a few of these variables, the impact of one single thing might not be as clear as if you hadn't already manipulated a number of the variables and you were able to see the effects without the other variables there already having been moved from
Yeah,
the status quo.
Yeah, and to Jim's point, a carbon price is taxing, if you will, natural gas. So we wouldn't double tax it, if you will. And so it really doesn't make a difference if you're doubling it.
We have another suggestion from Karen about how much more renewable energy would be needed with electrification for transport and buildings. That's true. We haven't looked at electrification, what impact electrification would have on the system.
And
So I think, oh, go ahead, Lago.
transport. And do it for transport, electrification for transport.
Yeah, well, Dave, do you have a comment on this one?
Sure. So this was I was a little surprised at first as well when we saw that nothing happened when we were having massive electrification of our buildings and industry. So there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that we've already made our buildings very energy efficient by ramping up the rate of increase of energy efficiency there. And so even if we are electrifying our buildings, they're already using very little energy to run on. And so that's not going to have as big an impact as it would have if we had not already invested in energy efficiency. The second piece here is that by switching from natural gas to electrification, there's a couple of dynamics going on there. One is that with the very high carbon price, much infrastructure has already switched away from natural gas at that point. And so there's already, without investing further in specific electrification programs, we've already moved away in large parts of the sector from heating our buildings with natural gas, for example. Because our electricity sector is already so heavily dominated by renewable energy, most of the electricity that we're now switching our heating and other applications in our buildings to is coming from a clean source. So it's not having a huge impact either way, basically, in electrifying our buildings, given all of the changes that we've already made. But yeah, let's go ahead with Lago's suggestion about electrifying the transportation sector.
Well, we're getting close, but I think David's point is well made regarding, the fact that once you start switching over to renewables, electrification is not probably quite as measurable as it is before then. But yeah, it helps, and we're moving in the right direction. We've moved, I think, about 9 or 10 levers, but now I guess, yeah, but we're still a half a degree above where the Paris Accord would like us to be. And that tells us that we probably have to do more. It also tells us, as Bill Gates tells us in his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, that it's going to be hard. It's going to be challenging, and it's going to take a lot of effort in a lot of different areas.
And just as we're watching our time frame, we want to make sure we have time to have face-to-face conversation with you.
If we have time,
you
we just have
see
one
how
last suggestion in the chat here from Virginia about if we could increase technological carbon removal.
That's exactly right.
Wow. Now we're getting close. So I would guess that there are going to be more than one different type of carbon removal technologies developed, but the one that's probably now is called carbon capture and sequestration. That means taking carbon out of the air, either at the source or just out of the atmosphere in general, and sequestering, putting it in a place where it will no longer affect the Earth's atmosphere. And I think we might be talking about some of those technologies. My son actually worked for a carbon capture technology, which is known as global thermostat. And there are others that are moving forward now.
And on this graph, that's reflected in this color right here on the chart. There's other ways to remove it, which include bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, improving how we farm and agricultural processes such that the soil retains more carbon, burning biochar and other technologies that definitely contribute to this overall component. Well, I would suggest, given our time frame, that we look at what we've accomplished, and let's chat a little bit about, well, what does it all mean? Looking at all of these sliders.
Shall I jump in?
That'd be great, Rob.
Hey, everybody, Rob. So we're going to allow you to ask questions, but I do have a couple of prompts that we'll start with. And then, but you can feel free to say whatever you like. So the first prompt is if you would like to share anything about this simulator that surprised you. You could put it in the chat. You can also unmute yourself and say it verbally. I'll look at the chat. I can read it out loud if anybody wants to type in something that you hadn't expected, or maybe you thought was going to turn out differently.
I guess I was surprised at how much coal and oil there still is.
Right. Yes, I know. I heard the same things. You know, there's the peak oil was kind of the buzz a while back. So
Yeah.
it's good to know.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I'm just wondering how much, we did everything in different sequences. If there's any difference in which levers, the order in which you use the levers.
Well, I would just answer that by simply saying, if you saw what carbon capture, carbon pricing does by itself alone before you implement other, levers that we looked at, it's impressive that by itself really, if you reset all those.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
So this is before any of the other actions. If we first went to a carbon price.
And you see, just by itself, it dropped it almost a full degree. And if you put it all the way out there, it'll also drop it even further. But that single action not only lowers the global temperature and the gas emissions, but it also is a very powerful tool for enabling some of the other things that need to happen. Because if you have a high price on carbon, it's going to help with energy efficiency. It's going to help with all sorts of other things that need to happen. So it does a lot on its own, but it enables a lot of other things that need to happen.
And it primarily pushes more of the energy source into renewables, but also it reduces overall demand to a certain extent.
Can I ask, looking at the simulator, you'll hear a lot of discussion about the impacts of methane. And if we were able to reset or reduce methane by, I don't know, pushing out a lot more synthetic meat and other byproducts that we could get to reduce the methane, does that make a difference?
That's a good high leverage action. Now, again, this also includes agricultural methane, and now we're talking about cultural and social implications of what are people willing to do relative to the foods that they eat, and the speed at which the farming community can move towards more sustainable green farming than is being done now, which produces so much of our crops. So yeah, that's really excellent on the synthetic side. And then we also need to address all of the cultural and psychological aspects of this.
I will say that there is a lot of excitement amongst farmers in the agricultural field about soil and its potential for sequestering carbon through crops, crop rotation, even grazing of the meat animals. There's a lot of excitement and interest in helping, just by, it's actually win-win for the farmers. Their soil is healthier, and the water management of farming can be much better with what we've learned about crops and how they prevent the soil from drying out, and some of these plants can actually take carbon and put it into the earth. So it's really exciting. There's a documentary on Netflix, Kiss the Ground, I think, which is really, really enjoyable, just about that.
Yeah, it's exciting. I think one thing that using the simulator really shows us is that we need a lot of action on a lot of different fronts. We're not talking one or two things. We are talking about changes across the board. And they're not just future. The exciting news is that a lot of it's going on already. And actually, we'd like to show you very quickly about one change relative to one component of modern society and what is happening at this point. And this is a couple minutes.
The world is expected to add more than 2 trillion square feet of new building space by 2060. That's the equivalent of adding another New York City every month for the next 40 years. Many of these buildings will be made using cement, a massive emitter of greenhouse gases. But a company in Canada discovered an innovative way to reduce cement's carbon footprint.
The effects of climate change are going to happen. We're seeing it every day. but this is a solvable problem. Our industry can decarbonize. Cement is the glue, it's the active ingredient in making concrete, and is the product that we build modern society with.
People often ask, what is the difference between cement and concrete? Cement is really the chemistry behind concrete. A simple analogy would be if you're baking a cake. The flour would be the cement, and the cake would be the concrete, the finished product.
To make concrete, you dig up limestone from the ground, and then you run that through a kiln. Each pound of limestone that you put into this kiln, 1/2 goes up into the atmosphere as CO2. CarbonCure is a technology company helping concrete producers transition into the new low carbon economy. We developed a technology that bolts on to an existing concrete plant. We're starting with a greenhouse gas, a harmful waste product, and we're turning that into value. We add a small amount of CO2 to react with the chemistry from cement that allows you to create a higher strength concrete. Carbon utilization is not just some abstract idea. It's not just happening in the lab. It's happening in the real world.
The concrete industry has worked for years on sustainability, and so now we're looking for new technology. And CarbonCure sequesters that CO2 into the concrete, locks it in forever.
Then you can actually lower the amount of cement in that concrete. It's really taken hold, and it's building real things that we can live in and drive on every single day, with overpasses and roads, airports, aquariums, or it could even be tech campuses. CarbonCure is on a mission to reduce 500 megatons of CO2 emissions per year. That is the equivalent of taking 100 million cars off the road, or the equivalent of the CO2 reductions from 500 million acres of trees annually.
We're finding in the marketplace, both with our customers and internally, people are proud to work for someplace that is taking care of the environment.
I'm doing it for my family. I'm doing it for my daughter. There's a real human toll to climate change, but absolutely the solutions are there.
And-
Okay, I was just going to quickly say that that's just one thing that I pulled up from Bill Gates. Again, his book called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster looks at all industries, and I'm sure whatever business you have, your industry, your business will be affected by multiple things that are happening in the technological world. But many technologies exist, many technologies are yet to be discovered. And the people who get in on the ground floor are really going to reap the rewards. So, yeah.
And particularly with this audience, Chamber of Commerce members, we felt that it would be very helpful to just segue, if you will, into some of that. What is going on and what does this mean for you? And there are exciting things happening. David, do you want to briefly chat about something that's going right here in Massachusetts? And you're muted.
Sure. Thanks, Meg. Hey, folks. So one of my colleagues who I volunteer with, he works at the Engine, which is an MIT startup accelerator right here in Massachusetts. And one of the companies that he works with is called Boston Metal, and they have invented a new way of producing steel and a whole bunch of various industrial metal alloys that does not rely on coke. So coke is this sort of coal byproduct that releases a lot of greenhouse gases in the process of creating it, and then also in utilizing it to produce all of these metal alloys, including steel. One of the examples, the way that their technology works is they use an electrified process called molten oxide electrolysis. And so rather than relying on the combustion of coal and to produce coke, and then the chemical reaction of coke with the iron to produce the steel that releases all this carbon dioxide in the process, they can use just the metals themselves and this electrification process that doesn't produce any emissions but in and of itself at all. So if you can find a clean electricity source, then you can remove most of the emissions associated with industrial alloy production. And so this is a really exciting example of another industry that could be totally transformed, and the opportunities that exist in this decarbonized economy.
Thanks, David. And I think as we're getting close to the time frame for the seminar, maybe just to summarize, maybe a little bit of what En-ROADS in this just overview and an introduction to you. It's a tool. It's for understanding systems and scope and scale, and helps support decision-making. It could be of help, for example, in the community of Worcester. Worcester is developing the Green Worcester Plan. There's a lot of decisions that are being made, have been made. Whether this tool would help people recognize whether the investment and focus is the best, can be of value, that there's no silver bullet to solving the problem. We need action across the board. As you saw in some cases, it takes long for our interventions to really have an impact. So there's urgency. I capitalized now because it means more steps now and bigger steps now, because we can't flip a switch later down the road. And because it is a global problem with implications across all aspects of society and the economy, we either help or we hinder it. There's no middle ground. There's no sitting this one out. Yeah, there's risk, but there seems to be a lot of opportunity. And again, from a business perspective, it would seem important to understand the risks and opportunities that there are.
I was just going to say that I didn't know a lot about what the position of the Chamber of Commerce was regarding climate and carbon pricing, but I did read a couple printouts of things that was put out by the International Chamber of Commerce as well as the US Chamber of Commerce. And I was pleasantly pleased to see how many of them were very congruent with many of the goals and objectives that we at Citizens Climate Lobby and those pushing for a price on carbon agree. Some of the main things that they came up with in those two written up pieces from the chambers were that we do need a price on carbon, that we need to make it sure it's market-based according to the Paris Accord, that there is transparency, that there is fair trading, that there's no carbon leakage. And one of the things that struck me most, and goes with the point that Meg just made, is that they wrote in there, inaction is not an option. And that to me sums it up. We really need to move ahead full speed, starting immediately.
And just before I turn it over back to you, Stephanie, I will provide Stephanie with some information with links to really helpful resource information that they can distribute to you. One of them I would really like to suggest you check out is Business Climate Leaders, because they have done documents and studies and communication and support of businesses in what the implications are, particularly of carbon pricing and the advantages, the rewards, how it's going to happen. There may be some really helpful thoughts and ideas, because for you as a business, it's probably, again, another thing not to wait for. Begin planning. You may not need to take action right now, but depending on what business you're in, maybe it is a good time for you to start thinking about how you operate and how you might be modifying that in the future. So at least you have a plan and you're starting to think about your capital investment, changes in where you're getting your energy, changes in how you operate. There's a lot that you'll want to think through, because you will be making some changes. There'll be more, there'll be less in going forward. With that, we'll let you close it up, Stephanie. Thank
Oh
you.
my goodness. Well, I could talk about this all day. So that hour just went by so fast. But just Meg and Jim, Rob and David, thank you all so much for your incredible level of expertise, your level of passion, and your takeaway of a sense of urgency. I think that was certainly felt and heard very clearly. And I know, to Jim's point, as a Chamber of Commerce, we're committed to keep having this conversation, to keep this at top of mind with all of our members and our businesses. And En-ROADS, the simulator, is just an incredible tool that is really a gift for us to have for everybody, to say this is where we are at right now, and this is where we can be. So I really appreciate you opening us up to this, and I look forward to that follow-up, Meg, and we're going to share this with more members. So thank you all, and for everyone who participated today, we really appreciate your time.
Yes,
Thank you all for coming.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Refer us
day.
to anybody.
Thank
We'll
you.
do it. We'll do it again.
Thank
Anyone
you.
that wants to see this.
Yes.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.